Paul Cuffey is said to have participated in the colonialization of Sierra Leone. It is also stated that Cuffey himself is of mixed ancestry. His father captured at a young age and shipped into slavery in America. His owner, being Quaker, could no longer morally support the institution of slavery, and Cuffey's father was set free. Afterwards, he married his mother, who was a member of Wampanoag Nation. Cuffey is quite possibly one of the first mixed Native American and Africans to gain prosperity in America. Cuffey's father, after being freed, owned a 116-acre farm and his home, in which Cuffey inherited after his death. By the age of 24, Cuffey was beginning to establish a shipping empire, owning a fleet of ships in which he ran trade enterprises up and down the Atlantic coast, the Caribbean, and even Europe. By 1800, Paul Cuffey was the richest African Indian American in the country. Due to the discrimination and racism endured by blacks in this country, Cuffey decided that people of color would only achieve equality if they moved to Africa. He was one of the first Black Americans to embrace this idea. This would eventually be known as the Back to Africa movement, although Cuffey himself was only half African and half American Indian.
In April 1980, a tragedy unfolded in my country, the small West African nation of Liberia. People had come to celebrate a military coup against their government and the cold-blooded murder of their president. They watched as 13 former cabinet members were stripped, tied to poles, and executed. It was hard to believe in that moment that Liberia was Africa's oldest republic, founded 133 years before on the promise of peace and freedom for the American blacks who settled here during a time of slavery. But now the peace had ended, and there was worse, much worse to come.
These populations composed of Indians who were either free or formerly enslaved. It's important to note that the American colonial society presidents were politicians. The first president was nephew of George Washington and a member of the Supreme Court, Bushrod Washington. Other members of the American colonial society included large slaveholders like Henry Clay from Kentucky. American Indians would begin admixing with the native African population at least as early as 1790, but not in the way that you may think. In 1860, the population of slaves in the U.S. reached over 4 million. But this is 50 years after the Slave Trade Act of 1808, which abolished the slave trade in North America. Between 1808 and 1860, we know that a large area of black Indians in the South were pushed out of their ancestral homelands by Andrew Jackson and the military. That was less than 200 years ago. It would literally be impossible for that amount to have come from Africa, considering in 367 years, less than 400,000 made it to North America, which is only 1/10 of that overall 4 million slave number. This is according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. So even the accepted academic narrative has flaws in its theory. The idea that black slaves were multiplying in great numbers instead of dying in great numbers is an asinine assertion. Slavery was cruel and brutal, and most women couldn't even conceive, and the average life expectancy was 24 years old. Slaves were considered property. There was no maternity leave. So the idea that these overworked and overstressed women were dropping babies left and right is foolishly and disrespectfully ignorant. After America gained its supposed independence, President Andrew Jackson took an even more aggressive approach to the extermination of Indians with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. By now, the African slave trade overseas had ended after the Slave Trade Act of 1808. But slavery in the South was still a quickly expanding business. But these slaves weren't African. In fact, there had been hundreds of different tribal villages and nations that inhabited the areas of the southeastern quadrant of the United States prior to any contact with Europeans who had maintained their ways of life at least 300 years after the year 1500. These nations were all forcibly removed and displaced from their homelands, but many were captured and sold into slavery. The reason the slave numbers skyrocketed during the early to mid 1800s is due to the wars that took place between the Indians and the colonialists, and the capture of Indians who were sold into slavery. The remaining 5 civilized tribes adopted European customs, forced out black members, and adopted slavery, and continued the practice for years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Andrew Jackson. Southern men idolized him. A rags to riches story. Given land in Nashville. Given a job as a lawyer. And pranced around Nashville with another man's wife. Oh, and by the way, is also responsible for the murder of black Indians. In the early 1850s, before signing the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln advocated for the colonization of slaves in Liberia and Central America. Slavery was not common among full-blooded tribes because they separated themselves from the ways of the European. These isolated pockets were not always considered part of the 5 civilized tribes. The 5 civilized tribes, of course, essentially supported the Confederacy and the institution of slavery. After the Emancipation Proclamation, former slaves were allowed to return to their tribes and become members of Cherokee Nation. The majority of these members were either emancipated slaves or were among the unlucky caravan who had been brutally driven west. During this process, the Indian nations were stripped of their communally held national lands, which was divided into single lots and allotted to individual members of the nation. The Dawes Commission required that individuals claim membership in only one tribe, although many people had more than one line of ancestry. Registration in the National Registry, known as the Dawes Rolls, has come to be critical in issues of Indian citizenship and land claims. Many people did not sign up on these rolls because they feared government persecution if their ethnicity was formally entered into the system. People often had mixed ancestry from several tribes. According to the Dawes Commission rules, a person who was 1/4 Cherokee and 1/4 Creek had to choose one nation and register simply as 1/4 Cherokee, for example. That forced individuals to lose part of his or her inheritance and heritage.